In early June of 1968, on a soundstage in Los Angeles, a woman in television wardrobe stood under hot studio lights and waited for her cue. She was 46 years old. Her husband had been dead for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, she had learned that the roughly $20 million she had earned across 2 decades of films and records was gone, consumed by investments she had never approved, routed through accounts she had never seen, managed by men she had trusted with everything. She owed the government $450,000 in taxes. And the television series she was about to begin filming was a show she had never agreed to make. Her husband had signed the contract without telling her. Now the contract was all she had left. The name on the call sheet was Doris Day. For more than a decade, that name had been synonymous with American optimism itself. The brightest smile in Hollywood, the biggest box office draw in the country, a woman whose public image radiated such complete control that no one had ever thought to ask what was happening behind it. No one asked because the surface was perfect, and the surface was perfect because the people destroying everything beneath it needed it to be. This is the story of how one of the most successful women in American entertainment had her entire fortune stolen by the two men closest to her, her husband, and her attorney, across 12 years of concealment, self dealing, and financial ruin. It is a story about trust, about the cost of a carefully maintained image, and about a woman who discovered at 46 that the life she had been living had never existed. To understand how Doris Day ended up walking onto that soundstage with nothing left but a contract she never signed, you have to go back. Not to Hollywood, not to the marriage, not even to the first time a man told her he would take care of everything. You have to go back to Cincinnati and to a girl who was not yet Doris Day and who did not yet know that her life would be shaped over and over by men who mistook control for love and by a trust so deep it became its own kind of blindness. Doris Mary Ann Kappelhoff was born on April 3rd, 1922, in Cincinnati, Ohio. Her father, Frederick Wilhelm von Kappelhoff, was a music teacher and choral director. Her mother, Alma Sophia, was the one who paid closer attention to the girl's ambitions, the one who noticed what her daughter wanted and then, when everything fell apart, found a way to redirect it. What Doris wanted from a young age was to dance. She was serious about it, disciplined, already training with the kind of physical rigor that would later show up in her screen work. The precision of her movement, the way she held a frame, the athleticism underneath the softness that audiences would eventually read as effortless charm. Dancing was the plan. It was the future she could see. And then, when she was still a teenager, a car struck the train she was riding in. The collision shattered her right leg so badly that the dancing career was over before it had properly started. She was bedridden for months. The body she had planned to build a life on had failed her, and she was too young to have a contingency. What she had instead was time, long, empty, painful weeks of recovery, and a mother who was not willing to let the girl sink into that emptiness. Alma arranged singing lessons with a local vocal coach named Grace Rain. And Rain recognized almost immediately that the teenager could sing with a clarity and emotional directness that most professionals never achieve. The lessons were meant as rehabilitation. They became a vocation. By the time the leg healed, Doris Kappelhoff was no longer a dancer. She was a singer, and the trajectory of her life had been permanently altered by a collision she had no power to prevent. That origin matters because it establishes the first iteration of a pattern the rest of her life would confirm. Doris Day's career did not begin from ambition in the conventional sense. It began from injury. She was redirected by catastrophe before she was old enough to name what had happened to her, and that rhythm, loss followed by reinvention, crisis followed by performance, the worst thing that could happen followed by the discovery that she could survive it and build something new, would repeat across decades. It is the rhythm of her entire biography. What changes each time is the scale of the catastrophe and the cost of the survival. Within a few years, she was performing with big bands under the name Doris Day, a name borrowed from the song Day After Day and chosen partly because it was easier for marquees and radio announcers than Kappelhoff. She sang with Les Brown and his band of renown, and the fit was immediate. Her voice had a warmth and an emotional precision that made listeners feel she was singing directly to them, not performing at them, not displaying technique, but communicating something real through the music. She could make a standard feel personal. She could make a ballad feel like a private conversation overheard. By her early 20s, she had become one of the most sought after vocalists in the country, and the trajectory was steep and accelerating. Sentimental Journey, recorded with Les Brown in 1945, became one of the defining songs of the post war era. It captured a mood the entire country was feeling: soldiers coming home, families reassembling, the fragile hope that ordinary life might resume, and it made Doris Day a national name almost overnight. She was 23 years old, already a single mother, already a survivor of domestic abuse, and the public knew none of it. What the public knew was the voice, clear, bright, emotionally present, and seemingly unburdened by anything heavier than the melody. That gap between the private reality and the public sound was already enormous. It would only grow. Hollywood was watching. But before the fame, before any of it reached the scale that would make the later destruction so staggering, there was Al Jorden. Jorden was a trombonist, and he became Doris's first husband when she was still very young. What is known about Jorden comes largely from Day's own later accounts, relayed through her autobiography and confirmed in broad strokes by people close to her over the years. The picture is painful. She said he hurt her. She said that when she became pregnant, he pressured her to end the pregnancy. And when she refused, he became abusive, mistreating her, she later recounted when she was 8 months along. Their son, Terrence Paul Jorden, was born in early 1942. The marriage did not survive, and Jorden later died. In the larger arc of this story, Al Jorden might seem like a footnote. He is not. He is the first man in Doris Day's life who presented intimacy as shelter and then turned that shelter into a cage. He established a pattern she would live inside for decades, and the fact that she survived him, kept her child, kept singing, kept moving forward without ever letting the public see what she had come through, tells you something essential about the woman at the center of this story. She was gifted, she was hardworking, and she was capable of absorbing extraordinary private pain while maintaining a surface so composed that no one outside the household had any reason to suspect a thing. That capacity for composure would serve her career beautifully. It would define the Doris Day persona that audiences fell in love with: the brightness, the ease, the sense that everything was fine. It would also make her uniquely vulnerable to the next man and the man after that, who understood that a woman who keeps her suffering private is a woman whose suffering can be sustained indefinitely without anyone outside the household ever having reason to intervene. Terry, the boy born out of the first abusive marriage, would later be adopted by Martin Melcher and become Terry Melcher, a name that would carry its own weight in the music industry. He would go on to produce records for the Byrds, for Paul Revere and the Raiders, for the Beach Boys, work that positioned him as one of the most influential figures in the California sound of the 1960s. But in the early years, he was simply the child carried through the wreckage of his mother's first life, a boy folded into whatever household came next, absorbing the rhythms and the silences and the unspoken arrangements that shape a child long before he's old enough to name them. When Martin Melcher adopted him, the family name consolidated. Terry Jorden became Terry Melcher. The boy's identity was now formally tethered to the man who controlled his mother's career, and the household that took shape around that consolidation was, on its surface, one of the most professionally successful family units in Hollywood. Doris was the star. Martin was the operator. Terry was the son growing up inside a world of money, access, and industry power. The public version of this family was bright, stable, enviable. The private version was a system of dependency in which one woman's extraordinary talent generated the wealth, and two men, her husband and increasingly her attorney, decided what happened to it. And what came next was the construction of one of the most successful entertainment empires in post-war America. By the late 1940s, Doris Day had moved from big band success into solo recording stardom, and Hollywood had taken notice. Warner Brothers signed her, and her first film, Romance on the High Seas in 1948, demonstrated something the studio had not entirely anticipated. The voice translated. She could act. She had a natural ease on camera that made audiences feel they were watching someone real rather than someone performing. And the combination of vocal talent and screen-like ability was commercially powerful in a way that the studio system knew exactly how to exploit. More films followed quickly: musicals, dramas, comedies, and with each one, the scale of her fame expanded. By the early 1950s, she was one of the most bankable stars at the studio, generating revenue that would have been difficult for anyone in her orbit to fully comprehend. The infrastructure around her was growing to match, and the question of who would manage that infrastructure, who would stand between Doris Day and the machinery of Hollywood finance, was about to be answered in a way that would determine the rest of her life. That infrastructure had a name: Martin Melcher. She married him in 1951. By all accounts, Melcher was shrewd, energetic, and deeply attentive to the business architecture of Hollywood in a way that Doris was not and had no particular desire to be. The appellate court would later describe him, in a phrase that captures the entire marriage, as her surrogate in all her business and financial affairs. Publicly, he was husband, agent, co-producer, the man who helped Doris Day navigate the transition from studio contract player to independent star. After her contract with Warner Brothers ended following Young at Heart, it was Melcher who steered the decision not to renew, a move that opened the door to more lucrative and more artistically ambitious projects. From the outside, that looked visionary. It looked like a husband leveraging his wife's talent into maximum independence, and for a time, the results seemed to validate everything. The films that followed were not just commercially successful, they were culturally definitive. Post-war America wanted warmth, optimism, romantic comedy, a woman who seemed both desirable and safe, and Doris Day supplied all of it with a precision that made the whole enterprise look effortless. Pillow Talk in 1959, opposite Rock Hudson, essentially invented a genre, the glossy, witty, romantically charged romantic comedy, in which Doris Day played a woman who was smart, independent, desirable, and somehow untouchable all at once. Lover Come Back in 1961 and That Touch of Mink in 1962 deepened the formula. The pairing with Hudson worked because the chemistry was genuine and because the films gave American audiences exactly what they wanted at that particular moment: a fantasy of romantic tension that was sophisticated without being threatening, alluring without being overt, modern without being unsettling. Doris Day became the embodiment of something larger than any single role. She was the perfect image of post war American femininity: optimistic, intelligent, wholesome without being dull, desirable without being dangerous. Every major retrospective converges on this point. She was not just a star, she was a cultural ideal, a mirror in which an entire country saw the version of itself it most wanted to believe in. And that cultural function, the fact that her image did work for America, not just for the box office, is what made the later revelation so devastating. The woman the country used as proof that the world was bright and manageable, was living a private life shaped by forces she could not see, could not control, and would not fully understand until she was standing alone in the wreckage. By the early 1960s, by one widely repeated measure, she had become the only woman in American entertainment history to be the number one box office draw and the number one recording artist simultaneously. The scale of her commercial success was almost beyond comprehension. And the entire time, the private reality was simpler and more dangerous than any of it looked. Martin Melcher was not just her husband. He was the sole conduit through which her professional and financial life passed. Every contract, every check, every investment decision moved through Martin. Doris did not handle money. She did not review statements. She did not sit in on the meetings where her earnings were allocated, her taxes planned, her future structured. The court would later describe her as unsophisticated in the real world of finance. And while that phrase can read as condescending, it describes something more specific and more human than ignorance. It describes a woman who had built her career on talent and discipline, and who had consciously, perhaps even gratefully, handed the business side of her life to a man she trusted. Because the business side frightened her. Because Martin seemed competent. Because the arrangement freed her to do the work she was brilliant at. And because every year of success seemed to prove that the system was functioning exactly as it should. There is something about that logic, the logic of trust validated by outcome, that deserves attention, because it is the mechanism by which the entire catastrophe was enabled. When the films kept earning, when the records kept selling, when the household kept running smoothly, who would stop to ask whether the foundation was sound? Not Doris, who trusted Martin, not the studios, who saw a thriving star and a competent manager, not the banks or agents, who had no reason to look behind a machine that produced profit as reliably as hers did. Success became camouflage, prosperity became proof. And the woman at the center of the machine, the one generating all of the revenue, all of the cultural capital, all of the value that everyone else was feeding on, was the person with the least visibility into how any of it actually worked. That blindness was not an accident. It was the product of a division of roles that had calcified over years. Doris supplied the talent and the trust. Martin managed the access and the money. And somewhere in the comfortable efficiency of that arrangement, the space for an outsider to enter and take hold of the entire system opened wide because neither Doris nor Martin had the habit of questioning the people they depended on. Their dependency was mutual, and it was about to become shared, directed at the same man who would use it to dismantle everything they had built. Jerome B. Rosenthal walked through the opening. He became the Melcher's sole attorney by 1952. Within 4 years, he would be not just their lawyer, but also their accountant, their business manager, their investment advisor, and their record keeper. That accumulation of roles is the hinge on which this entire story turns, because each new title Rosenthal absorbed removed one more layer of independent oversight from Doris Day's financial life. A separate accountant might have flagged transactions a combined lawyer-accountant would never question. A separate investment advisor might have challenged recommendations that a combined advisor-attorney would simply approve. Rosenthal occupied every chair at the table. There was no one left to object, and the man who might have objected, Martin, was incapable of it. The court would later say that Melcher was awed by Rosenthal, and that word carries a weight the rest of the record confirms. Martin did not merely trust Rosenthal. He deferred to him with a consistency that left the family without any independent check on the man who now controlled their money, their investments, their tax planning, and their records. The physical arrangement tells the story as clearly as any courtroom finding. Melcher's office sat adjacent to Rosenthal's for years. They sometimes met daily. This was not the architecture of distant professional consultation. This was proximity converted into dependency, door to door, conversation to conversation, recommendation to recommendation closeness, the kind where a client's autonomy dissolves so gradually that neither party marks the moment it disappeared. Martin kept going back. Rosenthal kept advising, and the advice was always delivered with the authority of expertise, the fluency of someone who understood tax law and corporate structures and investment vehicles in a way that Martin and Doris simply did not. Expertise in this context was not just useful, it was disabling. The more complex Rosenthal made the financial architecture, the less capable the Melchers were of evaluating it independently. The system fed on its own opacity. Doris kept working. The camera kept rolling. And the public image of Doris Day, wholesome, controlled, professionally protected, bankable on a scale few women in Hollywood had ever achieved, sealed the system shut from the outside. No one looking at the most commercially successful woman in American entertainment had any reason to believe that the private architecture beneath the image was already compromised. That arrangement held for 4 years before it changed shape permanently. And when it changed, it did so with a quietness that made the transformation almost impossible to feel from the inside. On May 11th, 1956, Doris and Martin Melcher signed a set of retainer agreements with Jerome Rosenthal. The documents were short. The court would later call them simple, and the simplicity was part of the design. In a few pages, the agreements gave Rosenthal a 10% interest in virtually everything the Melchers owned and earned. 10% of a fortune that Doris Day had built with her voice, her timing, her ability to show up on a set and make millions of people feel that the world was kinder than it actually was. 10% transferred in an office on an ordinary day, presented in an atmosphere of routine confidence, as though this were merely the administrative formalization of a relationship that already existed in practice. Martin was relaxed. Rosenthal was handling it. The scene ended not with an argument, not with hesitation, but with signatures. And the quietness of that moment is what makes it ominous in retrospect. What the agreements actually represented was the legal architecture of capture. The court found that Rosenthal never adequately informed the Melchers of the implications of what they were signing. He never advised them to seek independent counsel, a step that any ethical attorney would have insisted upon when asking clients to hand over a contractual share of their entire estate. The court determined that the agreements were procured through undue influence, a legal term that sounds clinical, but describes something deeply human. A person in a position of trust using that trust to extract concessions that no properly informed client would grant. Doris later contended that she signed without reading the documents and was not even told it was a retainer agreement. Whether that claim is precisely literal or whether the truth is something more layered, a woman long accustomed to signing what Martin placed in front of her, a husband long accustomed to approving what Rosenthal recommended, the result was identical. The last meaningful boundary between trusted advisor and owner-operator had been erased, and neither Doris nor Martin experienced the erasure as anything other than continuity. It felt like the system working. It felt like Tuesday. That is exactly what made it catastrophic. The Melchers did not experience the fracture as a fracture. They experienced it as business as usual, and business as usual is what every fracture feels like when the people inside the system are the last ones capable of seeing what the system has become. For Rosenthal, the agreements changed everything. What had been informal influence was now contractual entitlement. He took to the expanded role with energy and appetite. Almost immediately, the money began to move in directions that served his interests as much as or more than theirs. Oil and gas ventures he controlled, investment structures that funneled Doris Day's earnings through entities Rosenthal had designed and from which Rosenthal quietly profited. A web of transaction that would grow more complex, more opaque, and more ruinous with every year that passed. The fortune was no longer simply being managed, it was being consumed slowly, methodically, invisibly by a system Doris Day had authorized with a signature she did not understand on a document she may not have read. And the tragedy of Martin Melcher's position in all of this is that he was neither innocent nor fully culpable in the way a simple villain story would require. The court record does not support flattening him into a cartoon thief. It instead describes a man who was himself deeply dependent on Rosenthal, who followed his recommendations almost without deviation, and who functioned as the conduit through which Doris's entire professional life passed. Whether Martin understood the full scope of what Rosenthal was doing, whether he understood too little, or whether he preferred not to understand at all, that becomes one of the story's unanswerable questions, and it is what gives the marriage its real weight. He is not simply the man who stole from his wife. He is the man who trusted the man who stole from his wife, and who lacked either the sophistication or the will to see it in time. The marriage is more tragic for that ambiguity, not less. And no scandal broke, no reputation shifted. The press did not call. The studios did not notice. Doris Day was still Doris Day. The comedies kept coming. The records kept charting. The smile kept working. America saw a woman at the absolute height of her powers, radiating control and contentment. Behind that image, in offices that sat side by side in Los Angeles, two men, one her husband, one her attorney, had just formalized an arrangement that would, over the next 12 years, devour roughly $20 million and leave her, at 46, widowed, broke, and bound to a television show she had never agreed to make. Those 12 years are what comes next. And they are worse than the signature that started them, because the signature was a single moment of misplaced trust. What followed was a decade of exposed self-dealing, concealment, and compounding financial ruin, executed inside a system that Doris Day could no longer see clearly, could no longer question, and could not escape until the man at the center of her life was dead and the wreckage he left behind was finally devastatingly hers to discover. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. The pattern had been established before the retainer agreements were even signed. As early as March of 1953, Rosenthal had negotiated the purchase of $3 million in federal land bank bonds for the Melchers on credit at an interest rate of 4.25%. That sounds routine. It was not. The state bar record later revealed that Rosenthal, in the same transaction, secretly arranged a better rate for himself, 3.5%, on a similar purchase. The difference meant the Melchers paid more than 400% more out of the pocket than their own attorney did on a nearly identical investment. That single transaction tells you everything about the machinery that was now in motion. The conflict of interest was not incidental, it was structural. Rosenthal was not occasionally taking advantage of his clients. He was building a system in which their money and his money moved through the same channels, and in which the channels were designed to deliver more to him than to them. And the Melchers, who trusted him to manage precisely these kinds of decisions, never knew. From 1956 to 1962, the scale expanded. Rosenthal promoted oil and gas ventures through entities he controlled, Phoenix Enterprises and Doneby, names that would later appear throughout the court record as vehicles for self-dealing. The structure was consistent. Rosenthal identified an opportunity, recommended it to Martin with the authority of someone who understood these markets intimately, and directed the Melcher's money into investments that ran through entities Rosenthal himself had designed, and from which he stood to profit. The appellate court found that the Melchers lost more than $4 million in these ventures between 1956 and 1968, while Rosenthal realized more than $400,000 in secret profits through the same structures. $4 million of Doris Day's earnings, generated by decades of studio work and recording sessions and public appearances, fed into oil wells and gas leases that returned nothing to the family that funded them, while $400,000 quietly arrived in the accounts of the man who had recommended the investments in the first place. The money went in through one door and came out through another, and the door it came out through led to Rosenthal's accounts, not the Melchers. This was not risky investing. This was not an advisor who made bad calls in a volatile market. This was a man directing his client's wealth into entities he had built for his own benefit, extracting profit from the flow, and then presenting the results in language opaque enough that neither Martin nor Doris could see what had actually happened. And because Rosenthal controlled the books, the statements, and the records, there was no independent source of information that might have revealed the pattern while it was still happening. The accounting failures made the opacity worse. Rosenthal was supposed to provide regular financial statements. The court found that the material he did provide was inaccurate and misleading, and that statements he was obligated to deliver were either late, incomplete, or never produced at all. In more than $2.2 million of Melcher funds deposited in Rosenthal's trust account could not be accounted for. That number deserves a pause. It is not the total loss. It is the portion of the loss that simply vanished into a trust account and left no legible trail. The family did not just lose money. They lost the ability to know what was true about their own finances. The records that should have told Doris Day where her earnings went were in the hands of the man who had redirected them, and he was not sharing. There is something about that particular form of betrayal, the destruction not just of wealth, but of knowledge, that goes beyond ordinary theft. A person who is robbed knows they have been robbed. A person whose financial records are controlled by the person stealing from them does not even have that clarity. Doris Day was living inside an informational structure designed to prevent her from understanding her own situation. The trust she placed in Martin and the trust Martin placed in Rosenthal had been converted into a closed loop in which the only person who knew the full picture was the person who benefited from keeping it hidden. And then came the hotels. Between 1961 and 1968, Rosenthal induced the Melchers to keep advancing personal funds into hotel ventures, the Palo Alto Cabana and the Dallas Cabana. The state bar opinion found that he failed to disclose that the hotels were insolvent and undercapitalized, and that he had undisclosed financial interests of his own in the projects. The Melchers' money went in. The hotels kept bleeding. Rosenthal kept recommending more capital infusions, presenting each one as the injection that would stabilize the investment, the step that would turn the corner. It never turned. The operating losses mounted, the mortgages deepened, the furniture notes accumulated, and the properties themselves became monuments to a particular kind of financial cruelty. Investments that existed not to generate returns, but to consume the earnings of a woman who had never set foot in them as anything other than a name on a document. Picture it from Doris Day's side for a moment. Somewhere in California and somewhere in Texas, there were hotel buildings with lobbies and guest rooms and restaurants and staff payrolls. And her money earned by showing up on sound stages day after day, by recording take after take, by being the brightest, most reliable performer in a brutally competitive industry, was being fed into those buildings to keep their lights on, while the man who sent it there skimmed from the flow. She likely never visited these properties. She likely never saw a guest ledger or an occupancy report. The hotels were abstractions to her, if she thought about them at all, and the man who made them concrete was the man who had every reason to keep the truth abstract. Rosenthal told Martin the investments was sound. Martin told Doris the finances were handled, and the hotels kept sinking. Martin's position in all of this grew more complicated as the years passed and more human and more difficult to judge cleanly. The court record does not describe a man who woke up one morning and decided to betray his wife. It describes a man who was in over his head, who had delegated his own judgment to someone more confident and more fluent in the language of money, and who kept following Rosenthal's recommendations because the alternative, admitting that the system he had built his authority on was failing, would have meant confronting a truth he was not equipped to face. Martin Melcher was the surrogate. He was the man who stood between Doris and the business world. That position had given him his role in the marriage, his identity in the industry, his reason for being the person Doris trusted above all others. If the business world turned out to be a lie, then what was he? If Rosenthal's advice turned out to be self-dealing, then what had Martin been doing for a decade except transmitting the instructions of a man who was robbing them both? The dependency ran in both directions and locked all three of them into a system that none could afford to question. Doris needed Martin to be competent. Martin needed Rosenthal to be honest. And Rosenthal needed both of them to keep trusting him, because the moment they stopped, the entire structure would collapse. It did not collapse. It held. It held because the cost of questioning it felt higher to each of them than the cost of continuing. That is the quiet mathematics of dependency, and it operated inside this family for 12 years without interruption. By the mid-1960s, Terry Melcher was no longer a child watching from the margins. He was a young man in his 20s, building his own career in the music industry, producing records that would help define the sound of an era, and old enough to begin sensing the contours of the household he had grown up inside. The deference, the opacity, the way all roads led back through Martin and then through Rosenthal. Terry had lived his entire conscious life inside a family structure organized around his mother's talent and his stepfather's authority, and that structure had shaped him in ways that would only become fully visible after it collapsed. He was the child who had been folded into the Melcher name, who had absorbed the household's rhythms and its silences, and who was now old enough to inherit not a fortune but a crisis. The court record shows that after Martin's death, Rosenthal attempted to maintain control through Terry, arranging his appointment as a state administrator and then moving to remove him when Terry refused to follow Rosenthal's direction. That sequence deserves attention because it reveals how thoroughly Rosenthal understood the family's dynamics and how willing he was to exploit them. He saw the son as another conduit, another figure whose authority could be borrowed and whose compliance could be assumed. And when Terry proved that the assumption was wrong, when the son of Doris Day refused to become the next surrogate through whom Rosenthal could operate, Rosenthal did not accept the refusal gracefully. He tried to have Terry removed from the position entirely, initiating yet another legal fight in a story that was already drowning in them. That refusal was one of the first acts of genuine independence in this family's history. Terry was 26 years old, standing in the wreckage of an estate he had been asked to administer, facing down the man who had controlled his family's finances for longer than Terry had been an adult. The baby born out of Doris's first abusive marriage, the boy who had no say in being adopted into the Melcher name, the young man who had grown up inside a system of concentrated authority, he was now the one saying no. And it would cost him years. The late 1960s brought a shift in Doris Day's career that tightened the financial pressure further. The romantic comedies that had made her the biggest box office draw in the country were no longer performing with the same force. Audience tastes were changing. The counterculture was reshaping American cinema from the inside out, and the culture was moving towards something harder, more cynical, more overtly mature, toward Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate and a new generation of filmmakers who had no use for the bright, frictionless world that the Doris Day comedies had embodied. The persona that had made her the defining female star of the early 1960s, optimistic, controlled, unthreatening, was beginning to feel like a relic of a decade that had already passed. The film still got made. The name still carried weight. But the commercial momentum that had masked the financial deterioration for more than a decade was slowing. And the gap between what the public image promised and what the private ledgers showed was widening with every year that passed. The camouflage was thinning at exactly the moment when the damage beneath it was reaching its most advanced stage. Martin Melcher, who had staked his identity on managing his wife's career, was still in control. And Rosenthal, who had staked his livelihood on managing Martin, was still advising. The system was intact. The system was also, by any honest accounting, bankrupt. But there was no honest accounting because the man responsible for producing one had made certain that no honest accounting existed. And then on April 20th, 1968, Martin Melcher died. He was 63 years old. The death was sudden enough that the household had no time to prepare, no opportunity to settle affairs or ask the questions that might have mattered. In the immediate aftermath, Doris Day did what any newly widowed woman would do. She grieved. She buried her husband. She absorbed the loss of the man who had been, for 17 years, the central organizing structure of her professional and personal life. Whatever Martin Melcher had been, protector, enabler, conduit, participant, husband, he was gone. The house was quieter. The phone calls shifted from career logistics to condolence. Friends came and went. And the woman Martin left behind had no framework for understanding the scale of what his absence was about to reveal, because the information she needed to understand it had never been in her possession. The revelation came through Terry. In the days following Martin's death, Terry Melcher, 26 years old, the son who had been absorbed into the Melcher name as a small boy and who had spent his entire conscious life inside the machinery his mother's talent had built, sat with Doris and told her what he and the new advisors had begun to discover. The picture was not merely bad, it was annihilating. The $20 million she had earned across decades of films, records, and television, a fortune that should have been one of the largest personal estates in Hollywood, was gone. Not diminished, not reduced by poor market conditions or an unlucky stretch. Gone. The investments were worthless or underwater. The oil ventures had bled dry. The hotels were insolvent. The accounts Rosenthal had managed held nothing close to what they should have contained. And beyond the absence of the fortune, there was a presence that made the absence feel even worse. A tax debt of roughly $450,000 owed to the government, sitting on the books like a bill delivered to a house that had already burned down. Doris Day was 46 years old. She was a widow. She was broke. And she was about to learn that the wreckage extended even further than the money. Martin, it turned out, had signed her to a contract with CBS to star in a television series. He had done this without her knowledge, without her consent, without even mentioning it. The show would become the Doris Day Show, and it would run for 5 seasons. But in the spring of 1968, Doris Day did not know it existed. She had not agreed to it. She had not been consulted. She had not sat in a meeting, reviewed terms, weighed whether television was the right move for a woman whose career had been built on film. The contract had been negotiated and executed by Martin and, by extension, by the advisory apparatus that Rosenthal had built around both of them. It was, in the most literal sense, a commitment made on her behalf by men who had decided what her professional future would look like, without asking her whether she wanted it. And because the advance money had likely already been spent or absorbed into the financial wreckage. Walking away from the contract was not a realistic option. The series was not an opportunity, it was an obligation. The last remaining asset attached to a fortune that no longer existed, and the only plausible route to solvency for a woman who had just discovered that every other route had been closed off years ago by people she trusted. For a movie star of Doris Day's stature, television in 1968 would have felt like a step down under the best of circumstances. Under these circumstances, it was not even a choice. It was the floor catching her after a fall she had not known she was taking. There is something about that convergence, the grief, the financial annihilation, the discovery of a binding contract she never consented to, that resists summary. It is not one catastrophe. It is 3, layered on top of each other in a span of weeks, and each one recontextualizes the others. The grief becomes different when the dead husband turns out to have been complicit in the financial destruction. The financial destruction becomes different when the only escape route is a contract the dead husband signed without telling her. The contract becomes different when the woman bound by it is simultaneously mourning and discovering that the mourning itself has been contaminated by betrayal. Doris Day was not simply a widow learning bad news. She was a woman discovering that the life she thought she had been living, the stable marriage, the managed career, the protected finances, the competent husband, the trustworthy attorney had been a construct, all of it. The real life, the one happening behind the construct, had been running for 12 years in offices she never entered and on documents she never read. And it had consumed everything she had earned and everything she thought she understood about the people closest to her. The double life the title of this story promises was not Martin's alone, it was the family's. Doris had been living in one version of her life, while an entirely different version played out in rooms she was never invited into. By mid 1968, once independent counsel had finally entered the picture, the full scope became clearer and worse. The Palo Alto Cabana Hotel was insolvent. The Dallas Cabana would be adjudicated bankrupt by May of 1969. The hotel wreckage alone would eventually cost Doris Day an unnecessary additional $500,000. According to the court, money lost not to the original investment, but to the cost of untangling the mess Rosenthal had created around it. And Rosenthal himself, rather than cooperating with the new legal team, rather than stepping aside and allowing the damage to be assessed, began fighting. He refused to turn over files. He refused to surrender records. He launched legal proceedings of his own, the beginning of what the appellate court would later describe as 18 separate legal actions against his former clients, a campaign of post-termination hostility that turned what should have been an orderly transfer of records into years of attrition. When Doris and Terry's side sought the appointment of a receiver to recover the financial documentation, sheriff's deputies went to Rosenthal's office. The man, who had controlled every aspect of the Melchers' financial lives for more than a decade, stood between them and the evidence. He would not unlock the file room. A locksmith had to be called. The deputies waited while the lock was defeated, and the receiver, once inside, found material information that had been withheld. Folders, statements, transaction records, the paper trail of more than a decade of self-dealing, concealment, and financial destruction, all of it sitting in filing cabinets behind a door that the man responsible for the destruction had refused to open. That scene, the deputies, the locksmith, the sealed file room, is the physical manifestation of everything this story is about. For 12 years, Doris Day's financial life had been locked inside a system she could not access. Now, in the aftermath of her husband's death, the locks were literal. The information she needed to understand what had been done to her was sitting behind a door that her own former attorney would not open. And it took officers of the law and a man with tools to get through it. White-collar misconduct became, in that moment, as seen with doors and keys and deputies and boxes. The abstraction became concrete, and the concrete was devastating. And in the middle of all of it, the legal warfare, the financial forensics, the dawning recognition of how thoroughly she had been betrayed, Doris Day went to work. Production on the Doris Day Show began approximately 6 weeks after Martin Melcher's death. 6 weeks. She had buried her husband, discovered the fortune was gone, learned about the tax debt, found out about the contract she never signed, and now she was standing on a soundstage in Los Angeles, in wardrobe, under hot studio lights, stepping through blocking marks and delivering lines with the smile that had made her the most beloved woman in American entertainment. The cue cards were ready. The crew treated the day as routine. The network treated the show as programming. And the audience, when the series premiered that fall, saw exactly what the Doris Day brand had always promised: warmth, charm, competence, a woman who made the world feel manageable. Nobody watching had any reason to suspect that the woman on their television screen was performing not out of creative desire, but out of financial necessity, that the series was not a career move, but a rescue operation. The only remaining lifeline attached to a fortune that had been gutted by the men she trusted most. The public saw a star calmly entering television. The private reality was that television was now debt service. Doris and Terry renegotiated the terms of the CBS deal to gain more control over the scripts and the direction of the series. That detail matters because it gives Doris agency in a story that could too easily reduce her to passivity. She was cornered, but she was not frozen. She took the obligation Martin had created without her knowledge, and she shaped it into something she could inhabit with professional discipline. And she used it over 5 seasons to dig herself out of the financial hole that Martin and Rosenthal had buried her in. The series stabilized her income. The specials that followed extended the recovery. Television, the medium she had reportedly never wanted to enter, became the tool that saved her. But salvation and betrayal were now permanently fused, and that is the contradiction at the center of this story. The contract that symbolized everything that had been done to Doris Day without her consent also became the vehicle through which she survived what had been done to her. The show that proved how completely her autonomy had been violated also proved how extraordinary her capacity for reinvention remained. She had been redirected by catastrophe before, by a shattered leg in Cincinnati, by an abusive marriage in her teens, and each time she had rebuilt. This time, the rebuilding happened on camera, 5 nights a week, in front of an audience that never knew what it was watching. The theme song played, the lights hit the set, Doris Day smiled, and nothing beneath that smile was what the audience believed it to be. What the audience did not see, what nobody outside the family's legal team saw for years, was the war that had already begun behind the production schedule. In December of 1968, less than 8 months after Martin Melcher's death, Doris Day and Terry Melcher filed formal complaints against Jerome Rosenthal. The filings went to both the civil courts and the California State Bar, and they marked the beginning of a legal campaign that would consume the better part of a decade and cost the family years of energy, focus, and money it could not afford to spend. The woman who had spent more than 15 years trusting the men who managed her life was now fighting one of them in open court while simultaneously performing on national television 5 nights a week. The contradiction was total. On one side of her life, she was Doris Day, the cheerful star of a family sitcom, delivering warmth and charm on a weekly schedule. On the other side, she was a plaintiff in one of the most complex malpractice and fraud cases in California legal history, sitting through depositions and reviewing financial documents that revealed, item by item, the full scope of what had been taken from her. The public saw one version, the court saw the other, and the woman living inside both of them had to hold the two together without letting either one collapse. Rosenthal did not simply contest the complaints, he attacked. The appellate court would later describe what followed as a campaign of post-termination hostility that extended across 18 separate legal proceedings against his former clients. 18. That number alone tells you something about the man the Melchers had trusted with everything they had. He did not retreat into the professional embarrassment that most attorneys would have felt upon being caught. He did not offer a quiet settlement or negotiate terms or acknowledge wrongdoing in exchange for a reduced claim. He launched proceeding after proceeding, wrongful retention of files, deceptive record production, bad faith maneuvering in bankruptcy courts connected to the hotel wreckage, motions to remove Terry as a state administrator, and a sustained legal campaign that appeared designed, at every turn, to drain time, money, and resolve from the people who had finally discovered what he had done to them. Each proceeding required a response. Each response required attorneys. Each attorney required fees. And for Doris Day and Terry Melcher, already fighting from a position of financial devastation, each new legal front opened by Rosenthal was another wound inflicted on a family that was trying to stop the bleeding. The legal system that was supposed to deliver justice was also in Rosenthal's hands, a mechanism of attrition, and he wielded it with the same fluency he had once applied to their investments. The hotel wreckage alone cost Doris Day an additional $500,000 that the court determined was entirely unnecessary. Money lost not to the original investment failures, but to the cost of cleaning up the legal and financial debris Rosenthal had left behind and then fought, proceeding by proceeding, to preserve. That figure represents the cruelest arithmetic in the entire story. Doris Day did not simply lose money to Rosenthal. She then lost additional money fighting Rosenthal over the money he had already lost for her. The system did not stop extracting value from her. When the professional relationship ended, it kept extracting through attorneys' fees and court costs and the sheer grinding attrition of a legal process that one party was determined to make as prolonged and as expensive as possible because the man who had built the system understood its mechanics better than anyone alive, and he used that understanding as a weapon even after the system had been exposed. The civil trial began on March 4th, 1974, nearly 6 years after Martin's death, nearly 6 years after the first complaints were filed. 6 years of depositions, discovery fights, and Rosenthal's relentless counter litigation before the case even reached a courtroom. When it finally did, the trial ran through the summer, session after session, witness after witness, the full anatomy of what Rosenthal had done laid out in courtroom testimony across almost 6 months. The evidence was voluminous. The self-dealing was systematic. The oil ventures, the hotel sinkholes, the secret profits, the missing trust account funds, the retainer agreements procured through undue influence, the failure to provide accurate accounting, the refusal to advise independent counsel, all of it was presented, documented, and weighed by the court with a thoroughness that would later fill hundreds of pages in the appellate record. For Doris Day, who had spent more than a decade not knowing what was true about her own finances, the trial was the first time the full picture was assembled in one place and presented in plain language. The truth she had been denied for 12 years was finally being spoken aloud, under oath, in a public forum. The trial ended on August 30th, 1974, and on September 18th, 1974, the court delivered its verdict, a judgment against Jerome Rosenthal in the amount of $22.8 million. That number entered the public record in the headlines, and it is the figure most often cited in later retellings of the story. It was, at the time, one of the largest malpractice and fraud judgments ever awarded in the state of California. A number so large it made national news and briefly reintroduced the private catastrophe to a public that had long since stopped thinking about what had happened to Doris Day behind the screen. The consolidated judgment, issued on March 31st, 1975, and encompassing all of the related claims, came to $26,396,511, including punitive damages. Both numbers are real. Both appear in the court record. The difference between them reflects the complexity of the consolidated litigation, not a contradiction, and the larger figure is the more complete accounting of what the court determined Rosenthal owed for what he had done. For Doris Day, who had been living with the consequences of Rosenthal's actions for 6 years by then, the verdict must have felt like something between vindication and exhaustion, proof that the system she had trusted had indeed been as corrupt as the evidence suggested, delivered at the end of a process that had required her to relive every detail of the corruption in a public forum. But a judgment is not a recovery, and that distinction is where the story turns from courtroom vindication into something quieter and harder and more representative of how justice actually works for people who have been defrauded by the professionals they trusted most. Rosenthal could not pay $22.8 million. He could not pay $26 million. He could not pay anything close. The headline number, the one that made the newspapers, not the one that seemed to promise that justice had been delivered in full, was an abstraction. The real number, the one that actually mattered to the woman whose fortune had been destroyed, was much smaller and arrived much later. In August of 1977, Doris Day settled with Rosenthal's insurers for $6 million, not $22.8 million, not $26 million, $6 million, paid in 23 annual installments. That is a detail worth sitting with. A woman who had earned $20 million over the course of one of the most successful careers in American entertainment history, a woman whose money had been systematically devoured by the man she trusted to protect it, received $6 million back, parceled out over more than 2 decades, one installment at a time. The math is simple and cruel. She would receive roughly $260,000 a year before taxes and legal fees as compensation for the destruction of a fortune that had taken her entire professional life to build. The fortune was not restored. The justice was not complete. What she got was partial, stretched thin, and paid on a schedule that meant she would be receiving restitution checks well into her 70s for damage that had been done to her in her 40s. The headline said she won. The reality was that winning in this case looked nothing like the number in the newspaper. The institutional reckoning took even longer than the civil case. In 1985, 17 years after Martin's death, The California Court of Appeal affirmed a massive judgment in Day versus Rosenthal, a decision that runs to extraordinary length in the appellate reports and that remains to this day one of the most detailed judicial anatomies of attorney self-dealing and client exploitation ever published in the state of California. The opinion traces the entire arc: the retainer agreements, the oil ventures, the hotel sinkholes, the accounting failures, the secret profits, the refusal to surrender records, the 18 legal proceedings, the locksmith at the office door, and it does so with a specificity that makes the court record itself feel like a kind of documentary. Every transaction is named, every failure is cataloged, every dollar is tracked as far as the available records allow. For anyone who reads it today, the opinion is not merely a legal ruling. It is the most comprehensive surviving account of how a single professional, operating inside the trust of a single family, can dismantle a fortune so thoroughly that the people who earned it do not even know it is happening until the person they trusted is dead or gone, and the wreckage is finally, unavoidably, theirs to confront. The appellate court's work gave the story its permanent record, the one that outlasts the headlines and the autobiography and the fading public memory of who Doris Day was and what was done to her. And in 1987, 19 years after Martin Melcher's death, 19 years after the first complaints were filed, the California Supreme Court adopted the state bar's recommendation and disbarred Jerome Rosenthal. The opinion traces the misconduct back to the complaint that Doris Day and Terry Melcher had filed in December of 1968, nearly 2 decades earlier, and it walks through the full catalog of violations with a precision that makes the legal record read like an indictment not just of one attorney, but of the entire structure of unchecked professional authority that had made his exploitation possible. Rosenthal was stripped of his license to practice law. The man who had sat in the office next to Martin Melcher's, who had met daily with the husband of the most famous woman in America, who had accumulated the roles of lawyer, accountant, business manager, investment advisor, and record keeper until there was no independent authority left in the family's financial life, that man was formally and permanently removed from the profession that had given him access to everything he destroyed. The process had taken 19 years from complaint to disbarment. Doris Day was 65 years old by then. She had been fighting, directly or indirectly, for longer than the marriage to Martin Melcher had lasted. There is a kind of satisfaction in that outcome, but it is a distant administrative satisfaction, the kind that arrives after the damage has been absorbed and the years have passed, and the person who was harmed has already had to rebuild from scratch using different tools entirely. Rosenthal's disbarment did not give Doris Day back the $20 million. It did not give her back the decade she spent in litigation. It did not give her back the marriage she had believed in, or the trust she had placed in her husband's judgment, or the years of her son's life that were consumed by legal proceedings instead of anything else. It closed a professional file. It did not heal a life. What healed the life, or at least stabilized it, was work. The same capacity that had carried Doris Day through a shattered leg in Cincinnati, through an abusive first marriage, through the discovery that her second husband had left her with nothing, carried her through the aftermath as well. The Doris Day Show ran for 5 seasons, from 1968 to 1973. And across those seasons, the format shifted repeatedly, from rural widow comedy to career woman comedy to something closer to the urban professional sitcoms that were reshaping television in the early 1970s. The changes reflected the network's search for ratings, but they also, unintentionally, mirrored the real transformation happening in the life of the woman at the center of the show. Doris Day had walked onto that set as a financially devastated widow performing under duress. By the time the series ended, she had used it to pay down the tax debt, fund the legal battle, and rebuild a financial foundation that no longer depended on anyone else's management. The television specials that followed extended the recovery further and ensured her financial security for years to come. The irony is permanent and unresolvable. The coercion and the rescue were the same instrument. The contract Martin signed without telling her generated the income that saved her. The medium she reportedly never wanted to enter became the medium that gave her back her autonomy. The series that proved how completely her agency had been violated also became the proof of how extraordinary that agency was when she was finally forced to exercise it on her own terms. She had been redirected by a catastrophe before, and every time she had built something out of the wreckage. This time, the building happened in public, on camera, on a schedule dictated by network television, and the audience never knew the difference between the cheerful woman they were watching and the cornered woman she actually was. That is, in the end, the most Doris Day detail in the entire story. Even the survival was a performance, and even the performance was real. In 1976, Doris Day published her autobiography, Doris Day, Her Own Story, written with A.E. Hotchner. The book was the first time the public heard the full private version. The abuse with Jorden, the dependency on Melcher, the Rosenthal catastrophe, the discovery of the CBS contract, the tax debt, the rebuilding. It was the moment the facade cracked in public, on her own terms, in her own voice, and the country that had spent 2 decades projecting its own optimism onto her image had to reckon, for the first time, with the woman behind that image. The title itself is a kind of declaration. After years in which other people had written the story of her life through contracts and investments and legal filings, this was hers. A later documentary, Doris Day, a sentimental journey, aired in 1991 and revisited the arc with archival footage and interviews, but the autobiography remains the primary text, the closest thing to an unmediated account of what it felt like to live inside the machinery that her fame had built and other people had captured. No major dramatic adaptation centered specifically on the Melcher Rosenthal scandal has been produced, which means the autobiography and the court record exist as the two pillars of the story, the emotional account and the legal one side by side, each illuminating what the other cannot. After the television years, Doris Day did not return to Hollywood. She did not seek a film comeback. She did not chase the kind of second act celebrity that the industry occasionally offers its former stars. Instead, she moved to Carmel by the Sea, a quiet, beautiful town on the Central California coast, and she turned her attention to the thing that had mattered to her for as long as anyone who knew her could remember: animals. In 1978, she founded what began as the Doris Day Pet Foundation, an organization dedicated to animal welfare that she maintained hands-on involvement with for the rest of her life. The Doris Day Animal Foundation remains active today as a grant-giving nonprofit supporting animal rescue and advocacy across the country. The Cypress Inn in Carmel, a hotel she co-owned for years, still frames its identity around her legacy and her commitment to welcoming guests and their animals alike. The public-facing Doris Day of the final decades was not the box office queen or the television star or the woman in the courtroom. She was an elderly woman in a seaside California town, surrounded by animals, largely removed from the industry that had made her famous and from the financial wreckage that fame had generated. The life she built after the catastrophe looked nothing like the life that had been taken from her, and there is a kind of dignity in that, in the refusal to rebuild the same structure, in the decision to build something entirely different instead. She had spent the first half of her adult life inside a system of fame, management, and financial dependency. She spent the second half in a small town with animals on her own terms. Whether that was wisdom or exhaustion or both, the result was the same. Doris Day's final chapter did not belong to Hollywood or to the courts or to the men who had shaped the earlier ones. It belonged to her. Terry Melcher's thread runs alongside his mother's, and it ends before hers does. After the legal battles and the estate crisis, Terry built a career that stood on its own, producing, songwriting, working in the music industry he had helped shape during the California sound era of the 1960s. He married and had a son, Ryan, who would grow up in the long shadow of both his grandmother's fame and his father's quieter, harder story. But Terry carried the weight of the family's history in ways that are difficult to measure from the outside and impossible to quantify. He was the son who had been born into violence, adopted into dependency, and then thrust into the role of messenger and estate administrator at 26. He was the one who told his mother there was nothing left. He was the one who refused to serve as Rosenthal's instrument when it would have been easier and less expensive to comply. He was the one who sat through depositions and court proceedings for years, fighting for accountability on behalf of a family whose trust had been exploited by the people closest to it. Whatever the financial cost of the Rosenthal catastrophe, there was also a cost measured in years of a young man's life spent inside courtrooms and lawyers' offices instead of anywhere else. Terry Melcher died in November of 2004 at the age of 62 after a long battle with melanoma. His mother was 82 when she buried her only child, the boy she had carried through an abusive first marriage, the young man who had delivered the worst news of her life, the son who had stood beside her through the legal war that followed. Doris Day had survived Al Jorden, survived Martin Melcher, survived Jerome Rosenthal, survived the financial annihilation and the legal attrition and the decade of rebuilding that followed. She had not been able to keep her son. In a dynasty story, the children always absorb the cost the parents incurred, and the cost is always deferred, paid later, paid differently, paid in ways the family did not anticipate and could not prevent. Terry Melcher paid his share across decades, and he was gone before the story was culturally finished. Doris Day died on May 13th, 2019, in Carmel Valley, California. She was 97 years old. She had outlived every principal figure in this story: the abusive first husband, the dependent second husband, the exploitative attorney, and most painfully, the son who had been her steadiest ally through the worst of it. She had lived long enough to see the world change several times over, long enough to become a figure of nostalgia before becoming a figure of history, long enough to be remembered not for the scandal that nearly destroyed her, but for the image that had made the scandal possible in the first place: the brightness, the voice, the smile, the sense that the world was a place where things worked out. Martin Melcher had been dead for 51 years. Al Jorden had been dead far longer than that. Terry had been gone for 15 years. Rosenthal had been disbarred more than 3 decades earlier, and the court record he left behind remains the clearest surviving anatomy of what he did and how he did it, a document that lawyers still cite in cases involving fiduciary misconduct and attorney self-dealing. The living family line now runs through Day's sole grandson, Ryan Melcher, who works in real estate in Carmel by the Sea, the same town where his grandmother spent her final decades, the same town where the Cypress Inn still carries her name. In 2025, Ryan and his wife Brittany welcomed a daughter, Madison Marie Melcher. The family name continues, but the inheritance it carries is not a fortune. It is a name, a place, a connection to animal advocacy, and the long, complicated shadow of a story that began with a young woman's trust and ended in a courtroom where the cost of that trust was measured in the tens of millions of dollars and the decades it took to account for them. There is no neat moral in any of this. What there is instead is a pattern, and the pattern is this: Doris Day was one of the most recognizable women in America, and yet the decisive facts of her own life sat in offices next to hers, in agreements she did not fully understand, in accounts she did not control, and in a television contract she said she never signed. The public image that made her beloved, the brightness, the composure, the sense that everything was fine, was also the image that made the private destruction possible, because no one looks behind a surface that convincing. A carefully maintained facade does not just hide what is wrong. It protects the people who are causing the wrong, and it ensures that the person living inside the facade is the last one to know. That is not a lesson. That is just a life.